This is a case board, a good investigative tool. It helps you keep important things out there visually, to keep it in your mind, keep you fresh in working on the case. And for example, here is an indicator of why you're working on this case. This is the grave site of this young girl, Caitlin Arquette, 18 years old when she was killed. Her grave shows flowers on it. People cared about her. This isn't just an exercise in investigation. This is a person that we need to care about. We talk about the problem with the Arquette case. Problems with the crime scene, we talked about it, the 8 or so versions of what really happened at the scene itself, time variances that are wrong, people that were at the scene, that weren't at the scene, that did things at the scene that other people said they didn't do at the scene. Very complicated. And the point is that there's not one verifiable fact in these initial reports. The APD investigation started out exactly right. It went right from the scene to the last place the person was, then they went to see the boyfriend. But then the case began to stagnate. And in the first 30, 60 days, the Albuquerque Police Department only interviewed 16 people. And 8 of those, they never even tape recorded the interviews or took formal statements from. Those were Caitlin's friends, the possible suspects. The other people that they did take formal statements were of a report that was made that had actually no bearing on the case. The investigators really did very little until the tip came in about the about the Hispanic suspects. And then the report is complete and done in the way you would expect it to be done. APD continues to consider this case as a random drive-by shooting, but they never interviewed, still to this day, the man found standing next to the scene. This chart represents the persons in control over the Arquette case, from the city to the police department to the district attorney. And there's an interesting tight group of people who had control over the Arquette case. In 1997, I met with Assistant District Attorney Dinelli, who was asking about the case and my involvement in the case. He didn't feel that the information we were providing was particularly helpful. He said it would be helpful if you could tell us the name of the shooter and produce the weapon. I pointed out to him that I felt that the man was at the scene. Paul Apodaca shot at another person. The police conducted a search on him while he was escaping the scene. He field stripped the .22, but police were able to confiscate it. My point being that I felt that the possible weapon from the Caitlin Arquette crime scene was in fact in the Albuquerque Police Evidence Room. I don't know that anybody followed up on that. The Albuquerque Police Department considered the Caitlin Arquette case a stagnant case, yet in following up, NIA, we interviewed almost 200 people. We developed a database of almost 500 people. We identified suspects. We identified possible motives. We identified relationships between people and to other cases. Police were looking for, early on, the gray Volkswagen. That was the Volkswagen seen coming from the scene after shots were fired. There's a space here for a Volkswagen Bug. The color was unspecified. That was information provided to police by Adrian Apodaca. He was Caitlin's next-door neighbor at 303 Alvarado, and their front doors were separated by less than 6 feet, 7 feet. They were intimate neighbors in that they knew each other from school. Adrian was friends with Caitlin's Vietnamese associates. There was even conversation that they exchanged drugs on a personal use. Adrian told the police detective that he saw Caitlin leave her apartment on the night of the murder between 5:30 and 6, and he noticed that she was being followed by a Volkswagen Bug. That information is in the officer's field notes, but it is nowhere in the police report. The officer didn't the case investigator did not feel that that was worth following up. The primer gray Volkswagen is what the neighbors at 820 Arno saw making the U-turn in the lot at 824 Arno. There were other activities going on around a primer gray Volkswagen. For example, the Vietnamese friends of Caitlin had Volkswagens of the same color. Reporters reported that police were looking at a Volkswagen out of California, but none of that information is in the police reports. Here we have an orange and yellow Volkswagen, and these are attributed to Paul Apodaca, the man at the scene. He admits to being at the scene in his orange Volkswagen. However, we have no independent verification on that. I included the yellow Volkswagen because his brother, with whom he is very close and very protective, also owned a yellow Volkswagen at the time. Somebody drove that Volkswagen that Detective Merriman saw at the scene away, leaving Paul standing there alone. Who could it have been? I hypothesized that it could have been Mark Apodaca, the passenger being Lee Padilla, who lived in the home around the corner that they were going to see in the first place. The yellow Volkswagen is interesting because if you remember when we did the display and Officer Wallace talks about getting to the scene, finding Detective Merriman standing there talking to the man, there was no other vehicle at the scene. She assumed that the man found at the scene, Paul, was the driver of the red car. Years later, when I interviewed her, showing her some of the crime scene photographs, her first comment out of the blue was, "Where is the yellow Volkswagen?" That was startling to me. We've never been able to resolve that. This Volkswagen represents the Volkswagen belonging to one of the Vietnamese that was being spray painted in the parking lot of Caitlin's apartment in a time frame either just before or just after the shooting. The stories are different. One person says one thing and one person says another, but the manager of the apartment confirms that a Volkswagen Bug was being spray painted because the neighbors complained about the overspray. We're talking about here locations of interest in the Arquette case. 401 Lomas, the scene. It's interesting because we cannot get a handle on what happened at the crime scene. If you don't know what happened at the crime scene, how are you going to have a valid investigation? 824 Arno, where the Volkswagen Bug made this U-turn, is interesting from several standpoints. The people who hang out there, the criminal activity that goes on there that has been documented. It has been linked to insurance fraud. It is considered to be a chop shop, and it is an after-hours hangout for police officers, Albuquerque Police Department officers. They party, said that they gamble, and they come here after the clubs close, and after one club in particular, the Roadrunner Club on the Kirtland Air Force Base. Many of the officers also hung out at that location, which is connected to the Vietnamese. We are told that Vietnamese frequented 824 Arno. Who also frequented 824 Arno is Matt Griffin, the officer who shot and killed Peter Klunk. Both of them worked on their cars. And one of the APD officers that frequented 824 Arno was listed in a civil suit as a babysitter for the owner's children, the owner being Michael Ariano and Frank Ariano. 303 Alvarado Southeast is the apartment where Kait was living at the time she was killed. She had only rented it a month or so before. Her boyfriend Dung moved in with her. Dung was not an unwelcome member of Kait's association. He had been at the Arquette family home, had dinner there. The family welcomed him. He was not an outsider. However, neighbors were complaining about the activities of the Vietnamese. They were loud, they were taking over the complex, and in the manager's apartment records, Caitlin was seeking refuge from Dung one particular night, wanting to spend the night in the manager's apartment with him and his wife. It's the scene of where they were spray painting the gray Volkswagen Bug. Police are looking for a gray Volkswagen Bug. It is also the scene of interesting phone calls made the night of Caitlin's murder, the next night from Caitlin's murder. And everybody has a different version about who was placing the call to the person called the capper, the person in charge of the staged auto accidents out in California. Pier 1 is where Caitlin was working at the time of her murder. You'll notice that Dung is in the picture with her. He frequented at Pier 1, and some people at Pier 1 didn't like that, but he was often there. He was known to the people in the area of Fair Plaza. Interesting that Caitlin's job was supervising the passport clothing division. Her job was to receive the shipping and to account for the shipping. Interestingly, Dung's job that he had at a place called Artwear was to do the same thing with t-shirts being painted by a well-known t-shirt artist. The connection is also interesting because on the night of the murder, when Caitlin was at Sharon Smith's apartment, Sharon says that Caitlin was there to help decorate the apartment of this very self-same t-shirt artist. The t-shirt artist disputes exactly what happened, but does say that he did work at Artwear. He did know Sharon. She hosted parties for him. And Sharon knew enough about Dung to provide the name of the manager of Artwear to Detective Merriman the night that he showed up. Sharon Smith had this snow cone business in front of Pier 1 and met Kait through that. Days after Caitlin's murder, Sharon Smith took Caitlin's job at Pier 1. She then got her boyfriend a job in the shipping department at Pier 1. They stayed just a couple of days, and they both left New Mexico, and they never picked up their paychecks. What was inside of Pier 1 that somebody had to control? Was there something that Kait knew of or was going on that they had to cover up? In our investigation, interviewing people at Pier 1, we came across a young woman who was an employee at Pier 1, a co-worker of Kait's, was there one evening and found a bag or bags of heroin in a box in the shipping area. She says she didn't know what to do with the heroin, so she took it home with her, and she called the FBI from her apartment, and the FBI came and confiscated the information. There's no record of any of that information in the police department's investigation. They did not profile Kait or her friends to see if there was any possible motive for her murder. Even though the Arquette family turned over to Albuquerque Police Department the information that Dung and Kait had knowledge of this ongoing insurance fraud information, Albuquerque Police Department did not feel that that was a valid motive for murder. These photos show the things that we talked about, the problem with the scene. The bullet hole. What caliber is this bullet hole? The criminalistics firearms expert, Steve Guerra, comments that he thought that was a bigger hole than a larger caliber than a .22. They discuss it among themselves, but that information does not get into the homicide report. The homicide report indicates that Caitlin was killed with a .22. The I-1 marker, the Albuquerque Police Department does not want to accept responsibility for this I-1 marker. I have no explanation for why. Why did they discount that? There is no explanation. Damage to Caitlin's car. This is the front end damage when it hit against the pole. You'll notice that the car did not hit the pole very hard. Going over the curb seemed to have slowed it down, so the damage was really minimum. This damage, the damaged pieces was left at the scene. It was there at the scene days later. APD never took that into evidence. This is the daytime picture of the car that shows the damage to the left rear quarter panel and back that indicates that that car was struck, and all information we can find is that that car was struck sometime after Kait left her parents at 6 or 6:15 on Sunday evening. Which takes us to another point of Sharon Smith saying that Caitlin arrived at 9:30. That means there are 3 hours that are unaccounted for that no one has seemed to feel the need to follow up on. The Arquette family put this information out, that where was Kait in these 3 hours? Sharon Smith went to unusual efforts, unexplainable efforts, to locate Mr. Arquette in a place that he would not have been known to be, except that she found him there, to say that, oh no, I never told the police that Caitlin arrived at 9:30. She arrived between different versions, between 5 and 5:30, 7 and 7:30. She said there are no unresolved hours. That's also information that has never been resolved. More information not there. The glass that is supposed to be the site of where the shots were fired, there's no glass there. This becomes complicated because when the criminalistics unit arrived on scene, someone else was there, another APD officer was there, and explained to the police what he thought had happened. And the Albuquerque Police Department acted on his information. So therefore, no glass in the picture because there wasn't glass. This officer just said there was glass. His role is still unresolved and under investigation by NIA. The orange colors are the suspects in this case. These are the 4 Hispanics. Robert Garcia calls Crime Stoppers and said he and Miguel Garcia, Juve Escobedo, and Dennis Martinez were in a Camaro and they shot and killed Caitlin Arquette. The problem was Robert Garcia could not have been there because he was in jail. Miguel Garcia denies his involvement. The other 2 have mixed information about what they provide. Nonetheless, the district attorney's office had to drop the charges against him. There has been an erosion of the case. They turned out that the information was based on false information, and there was nothing they could do about it, but they suggested that the Albuquerque Police Department take a look at the Vietnamese. What is interesting here is where the information came from about these 4 Hispanics. They were Crime Stopper tipsters, people with knowledge have identified them as federal drug enforcement sources. There's a common denominator among these people that talked about these 4 boys being the shooter, and that is Albuquerque Police Department Chris Padilla, who happens to be the brother of Lee Padilla, who Paul Apodaca went to see when he stopped to see and buy drugs from when he stopped at Caitlin's scene. The man found at the scene is a likely suspect. He was at least a major witness, never interviewed. But at the time he was found at Caitlin's scene, he had unprovoked attacks against women in the medical area. Caitlin, although she was a high school student, was taking medical classes at UNM. We have reason to believe that Paul Apodaca even knew Caitlin. He knew the Vietnamese. 3 weeks before the shooting of Caitlin Arquette, Ronald Apodaca and Paul Apodaca were arrested by APD on University Boulevard, not very far from the scene, shooting .22s and drinking red and white cans of Budweiser beer. They were arrested for unauthorized firearms under the influence. If you remember the crime scene when we talked about this before, one of the things they found at the Arquette crime scene was a red and white can of Budweiser beer. The 2 people I believe to be in the car that drove away from the scene is Mark Patrick Apodaca and Lee Padilla, all involved in criminal activity. Mark Apodaca is currently in jail for murder, a murder of a young man that they took off the street on University Boulevard, again, not very far from the area. He and 2 other men took him down to Socorro and killed him. Paul Apodaca went to jail to be able to protect his brother in jail. I hypothesize that he is protecting his brother, Mark, as possibly being in that car when Caitlin was shot. Other valid suspects, absolutely the Vietnamese. In any case, the first person that should have been a suspect was the boyfriend, Dong Nguyen. They were fighting. Caitlin was throwing him out. She was trying to avoid him. There was evidence of bad relations. Caitlin was telling people that she was going to go to the police and tell them about what she classified as dirty money. That is documented in her records, and that information was tried to be turned over to the police, but APD did not take that information. These 4 Vietnamese and at least 12 others are all linked to each other. They are linked to drugs. They are linked to car accidents. They're all involved in car accidents in Albuquerque, in New Mexico, in Colorado. There's arson fraud out in California. There's a death from the arson. There's deaths from the staged car accidents. We had information that they were involved in computer chip theft. And in the course of identifying all of these people, we found out that they were all UNM students. We pulled all their records. All of them were obtaining student loan fraud. All of them had obtained student loans, each giving the other as references. They defaulted on all those student loans. We turned that information over to the Student Loan Fraud Division. They just felt like that wasn't enough to continue to work on. But this was an organized group of people being organized and controlled out of California. These guys knew each other and were connected to Caitlin's next door neighbor. We found that out because Mark Apodaca and Adrian Apodaca's brother were engaged in a fight just months after Caitlin was killed. This group of people were all involved with each other. I can't find any links between these Hispanics and anything to do with Caitlin Arquette case. Other valid persons of interest is Adrian Apodaca, Kate's next door neighbor. He is interesting in that who he is related to. Well, first of all, he himself was a suspect in a killing. He has a police record. His father and his brother are involved in major activity, conversations about being controlled by police, stealing stuff out of police evidence, a very complicated group of people. Ray Padilla is a person of interest because he admits to APD that he was Dung's cocaine supplier. And at the time and around the time of the murder, he was involved in a cutting incident. He cut himself. That's interesting because on the day of Kate's funeral, Sharon cut herself or was bitten by a dog. The medical records don't support that she was bitten by a dog. It supports a cutting. Dong Nguyen was cut on the day of the funeral. And one of the Hispanics is involved in an unusual cutting or attempted suicide, and he said the Vietnamese paid him to do it. None of this information of possible witness intimidation is ever followed up on. Sharon Smith, absolutely a person of interest. She is interesting in her own right. She's interesting because she lied to get that snow cone cart at Fair Plaza. Why? There are several possibilities, but she set that cart up there possibly to target Caitlin. Possibly Kate fell into whatever was going on. She was interviewed twice by APD. The night that they went to the scene, followed the map, and then she came back in and was interviewed again. That information is not documented in the police report. She recounted it to others, and then when we asked about it, APD admits that yes, they did interview her twice. The information is not there. She took Kate's job. As we were investigating this case, as we've been for years, at one point in time, 824 Arno had a fire. We contacted the owner of the property. The owner of the property gave us permission to go on site. We were only going on site to be able to look to see what could be around, how the building was laid out. What we found inside that building was a check written to Sharon Martinez. Sharon Smith's maiden name was Martinez, by an employee at 824 Arno that had a relationship with Sharon in Colorado before they moved down to Albuquerque. The back of the check is endorsed Smith Deposit. That's right when Sharon Smith got married and became Sharon Smith. How can we explain that? I don't know. Sharon Smith is not available. We went to Colorado to talk to her. She would not be talked to. We even had an FBI agent in Colorado interested in this case, contacted Sharon Smith. Sharon refused to talk to the FBI agent. This last chart is what's so very interesting. Part of what we do is we investigate unsolved homicides. We do that at no charge to the family, and at the time we began this, we were connected with New Mexico survivors of homicide. On this list are 20 cases of deaths, murders, killings. All of them have persons in common to the Caitlin Arquette investigation. They involve drugs and they involve a snitch relationship. The other part of the chart shows the officers that are involved in Caitlin's case, that were connected to 824 Arno, and have links to other cases where they've been in trouble, where there has been some involvement that is not altogether positive or professional, and several of these people are no longer Albuquerque Police Department. The Albuquerque Police Department says that Caitlin Arquette was shot to death on July 16th, 1989 in a random drive-by shooting. How can you explain all of this information on the sheet? They don't want to look at this because it would open up too many cans of worms. You say, all right. A comment was made to me that, Pat, we have gotten rid of the bad guy. What difference does it make? What difference does it make is all of this is multiple crimes and multiple victims, and the city of Albuquerque needs to be protecting its citizens. Not just one girl, although she fully deserves a complete investigation of her case. But the city of Albuquerque is vulnerable because of this organized criminal activity that is being covered up.